Thank you for coming, everyone. I'm going to be talking about two subjects near and dear to my heart: rapid prototyping, so MVP stuff, and then Amplify. Not necessarily Amplify itself, but backends as a service, which support rapid like prototyping and things like that. But I've been learning Amplify, and I figured I would bring some of the insider information, inside scoop to this presentation. So let's a little bit about myself. I'm Sage Faraday. I spent about 14 years in the Air Force as I got to about Master Sergeant, so E7, before injury resulted in me having to get out. But I worked as an aircraft mechanic, and then I worked as a military intelligence operations person in charge of an intel team. From there, I spent about 10 years or so in software engineering. I started with Seagate and then moved to General Dynamics. And then I moved on to a startup called Adaton with some of the founders from Palantir to work for about 3 years on an app going to many military service members. So it was a very cool job and very fun. All right, so what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about why folks should care about MVP development, what is Amplify, and then at the end, I'll talk about what I talked about. All right, so why should we care about MVPs? Because about 90+% of startups fail, and the top reasons they fail are generalized into a category of the product not necessarily fitting the market. The product arrives at a time that's bad, so like the why now of a startup. Things like having to make pivots once you've started and you've realized the market's different and the pivot going bad. So these are all reasons why MVPs are important, and these are all problems that we're trying to solve with MVPs. So it's important that when we're building an MVP, we're using a tool that lets us move as fast as possible. So now that brings me to what is Amplify. It's a backend as a service. Basically, what that means is you get a whole bunch of pre-built tools to work with and be able to move quickly without having to build them expensively or manually. So it's heavily opinionated. So just a heads up, if you start with Amplify, if you try to go against the opinion of Amplify, you'll be doing a lot of work. So you'll want to know what kind of patterns Amplify uses so that you're not spinning your tires. It's part of AWS, so you'll have access to the whole AWS ecosystem. Amplify Gen 2 has added infrastructure as code. So basically what that means is you'll be able to define your front end and your back end and your AWS resources in a code base alongside the rest of your code, instead of having to manually go in and go into AWS console and like manually set things up. So you can deploy it consistently each time. And then it's also, so the infrastructure as code is TypeScript, and it's through the Cloud Development Kit, so the CDK. And so if you find that Amplify itself doesn't have some configuration you're looking for, you can move down another layer and use the CDK itself to make up for any gaps that or any customizations you need to do. So as I was saying, we can, one really nice thing about Amplify is it comes built in with some really easy to implement CI/CD. And to translate that, that's basically your engineer can commit code and then it's deployed. So going from just putting code onto a branch and merging it into another branch, that it takes care of the rest of the deployment for you, which is a big deal because usually you have to go in and you have to do like GitHub Actions or set up some kind of like GitLab runner or something else to handle that kind of deployment. And that saves a lot of time. So another thing you also get from Amplify is a whole front-end UI library. So like I was mentioning before, you get an auth component. Many of their components have different like really nice things they come with. So like field validation, when your user puts some data into a field, it will actually correct the user and say, hey, your password needs to be this secure. So there's like a whole like bunch of work that Amazon's done for you. In addition to things like building actual layouts. So you can use the Amplify UI library to do something like define a grid, which will have two boxes if it's in a desktop view, and then we'll stack them for like the mobile view. So it makes it super easy to kind of build all those things together. All right, so I have this picture to demonstrate kind of what Amplify brings. And it's, if you have developers as part of your team, they'll be usually working on the front end with the user interface client-side logic. So that's the tip of the iceberg. That means that you're working directly on your business problem. You're making like an interface that your users are going to see. You're able to focus on the design and like, spend more of your energy on that like user-facing side instead of having to deal with like database management, cloud storage, user authentication. You can even get push notifications and hosting. So you can have your URL, your domain be managed through this service as well. So this kind of visualizes what Amplify is bringing. It also supports a whole bunch of different front-end frameworks. So if you have React developers or you have Flutter, so React is Facebook's front-end user interface library, and then Flutter is Google's front-end interface library. Both of them are excellent. And then you can also just go pure JavaScript, or if you're going just mobile, you can go with Swift for iOS or Android. And so a lot of frameworks are supported by Amplify. And then this is one of the ones that I'm really excited about from a developer experience point of view. Every dev can have their own cloud sandbox. That's really important if you want to be able to have a dev do some test data. You want to let them mess with the schema that defines your backend, like the highly dangerous stuff that could mess up configurations or production data. You can allow them to create, it's identical to what gets deployed to production, which is also a big deal for testing and QA. But this can be spun up and spun down. So I can mess up my cloud environment all I want, and then I can just say, okay, this is too messed up, I'm starting over. So, and then back up, and it's fresh. So this, from a developer experience, was extremely useful for me. Another aspect that the documentation doesn't necessarily point out to folks is that you can actually visit all of these resources in AWS by going to, like, let's say you have a database, DynamoDB, and you want to be able to go visit that DynamoDB instance that the sandbox has created for you. You just go to DynamoDB in Amazon console and you can interact with it as if it's a cloud resource. So I can do things like add test data manually if I want to. If I have APIs, I can go in and test my APIs manually. So there's that. That's probably one of the big selling points to it for me. And then the management console is another thing that you get. So the Amplify management console is kind of like your user interface for managing your entire app. In this case, I have a branch deployed as main, which is production. And then I have a branch deployed as dev, which is staging. So staging is important to be able to say, hey, I'm going to propose that we bring this change to the users. And I want everyone on the company to be able to go to a URL and visit that version of the app and test it out. Be able to maybe give them like some kind of form to fill out for bugs or things that they discover. And it's identical to what's deployed to production. And then once your staging is okayed by the company, you can then, all you have to do to deploy it to production is to merge it over into the production branch. It also handles rolling back. So if you notice that one of your deployments failed, or users are saying, oh, I can't log in with the latest version that you've deployed to me, then you can actually use this to roll back to a previous version so that at least it's working with users before you go and, or so that you don't have like a whole day where it's not working for users while you're trying to figure out what the bug is.
Can that happen in like a minute?
Oh yeah, it's on the order of minutes. And then Amplify UI is like the whole front-end framework for Amplify. So this is where you get a lot of your free user interface components. There's also theming, so you can set up dark mode and have it be globally applicable to all of your front-end little widgets. And then if you, let's say that your brand changed colors or something and you're like, I just want to update everything all at once, you can do that through the theming. And then your engineers can also go in and do local changes to individual components and make updates in case a global theme isn't working out for some reason.
Are there other parameters that you apply globally to that, to UI pictures, other than colors, or is there attributes as far as how they'll behave?
Oh yeah, it's, if you know about like global CSS, it's pretty much the same. Okay. They've provided some object-oriented versions to work with, but you can fall back to CSS itself if you want to do some like wild stuff.
Far be it from me to ever do that. I always think more along the lines of like JavaScript actions and events.
Oh yeah.
Like if that stuff can be parameterized globally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you're working with React, you can do a lot of kind of JavaScript and styling at the same time, just working with components. So you can have global components or local components that you use for specific things. And by global components, I mean like React Router to be able to do like a single page application. So you can use basically anything in React for the front end. You're not limited in any way.
Amplify, this might be off topic. Amplify presumably plays very nice with Snowflake.
I haven't worked with Snowflake, no.
My understanding is that it's similar, but for backend.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the Amplify has some extensions that you can do to create your custom APIs. So if you have another service you want to work with, you can set up an API endpoint, like API gateway or Appsync, okay, and then just do a serverless Lambda function, have that call the API to reach out to the other service and kind of come back and interact with Amplify in the front end. Amplify is kind of like shepherding all of AWS's services, front end and back end, plus some extra freebies like the Amplify UI, which allows you to get that auth component, so you don't have to build some of the common stuff. And then it's also has a Figma integration. So if you have a designer who's going in and creating wireframes, you can generate some Amplify UI code from that and be able to get some free kind of tailored to you code if you use the Figma integration as well. And then finally, they also take into account accessibility. And one thing that I've been mentioning to folks that they might not know about is you can be sued for accessibility now. So if your website is not accessible, there's actually some lawyers going around kind of like farming lawsuits out across the country. So that's kind of a big ticket item that I like to mention. AWS is trying to take that into account with their Amplify UI.
Yeah, it used to be just public, like government sites, and now it's every website.
Yeah.
I know 2 people that have been caught by that. Yeah, huge lawsuits.
One
One
was
was
a
a
big
job bed
change.
guy, and then another one was draft tops. And it was just, it's like the attorneys went and paid somebody.
Yeah.
We'll pay legal fees.
Yeah.
No, they're
Farming.
sending out bots. They're not paying people.
Yeah.
They're sending out bots to go and test it and send them lawsuits.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like human incentives work. At scale.
Crazy. Yes, it's a real thing.
Yeah.
There's a local company that is on the receiving end of that scheme. WeCo.
Yeah, they do the testing with people with disabilities. Human testing.
This website was not tested. No, it was tested by humans.
Oh, gotcha. That's pretty cool. Have humans test it. All right. So as I mentioned before, there's the auth component, and this is what it looks like. So it hides a lot of functionality, including things like when you have a new user sign up, you can send them an email to have them do email verification, and that comes as part of this service. It creates an AWS Cognito user whenever they create a new account and they verify, and you can kind of build off of that as well. So you can have post confirmation Lambda actions. So if they sign in, do you want a chain of things to happen after a user signs in? Like maybe they get a custom welcome message or something like that. So you can listen for that in the back end. And then you can also listen for it in the front end. So if you have a user interface that has a sign in button, you can swap that out to sign out by listening to something called the hub, which will generate, it's like a pub sub interface that generates like authentication notification messages on the front end. So you're not having to implement that yourself as well. You can also get like do like a get current user call to be able to get who's logged in currently, like their ID, all that kind of information on the front end. And then that helps you when you're going to do APIs and you need to know like who's the authenticated user currently. How do I reach to the back end to get their specific database record? So it's one of those tip of the iceberg things. Like one of the things I had to do on a project I was consulting with was to tell them to stop implementing this manually. This is definitely one of those things where you don't want to reinvent the wheel.
Sage, can you pull reports from that to see like how often people are logged in or for how long? Do you know if that has that tracking component?
There's a pretty huge list of parameters that you can pull off of Cognito that keeps track of that. And I know there's some fields in the database that also get automatically created. So like if a user account is created and you do a action to create it in DynamoDB, DynamoDB will automatically add a couple fields like updated at and created at. So so there's
you
some
can see what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. I also highly recommend if you're working with all of these tools to check out Sentry. It's a tool that allows you to kind of put little calls in anytime an error happens or if a user is like stuck waiting a long time on something. You can put that in your front end, your back end, wherever, and it will collate all of your users and all of your data into like a single view. You can say, oh heck, people are spending like 5 minutes waiting for the login to work. That's the kind of answers you can get using Sentry, and that works very well with Amplify.
I'm assuming it has a whole bunch of built-in error handling
Oh yeah.
functionality, and does it make sort of dynamic recommendations around that?
So like
this is what you're likely to bump into with these. Here's a list.
I'm sure. Like I think Sentry added ChatGPT, so I think there's probably a button in there to be like, what ChatGPT, tell me about this error.
What is that?
Well, it'd be nice to have something that just predicts errors with this type of component, and then
Yeah.
give you messaging or routing.
Actually, now that you mention it, I was able to solve a problem because of that. What happened was I updated my API and then I forgot that I had done that. So I tried to sign in and it actually gave me an error message saying, here's the error code that you got from the back end. And it said post confirmation error. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm running a post confirmation Lambda function. So it'll take errors that happen in the back end and it'll show like in a little pop-up in this component what the error was. So I have, it's not super descriptive, but I've solved some problems with it.
If you could write tests against that, like, or get it to write its own tests against that, would be better.
Yeah. No, I should look into that some more. All right, and then back to the layout and input. So you can get a whole bunch of layout, like I was mentioning, you get the grid that you can set up to be like desktop or mobile. And then you have things like pagination, which is super important, where if you have 10,000 records, you don't want to show 10,000 widgets on the front. So you can paginate it, which means showing just like 10 of those widgets. And then a user can press a button and display the next 10 and kind of, or if you're scrolling on a screen and you need to like stack components in front of them as they're scrolling down, you can do things like that. Another big win that it brings is something called the drop zone, which is if you're trying to upload files, it's a very common pattern where you need a little zone that they can drag a file to and drop it on. Or you can click on the browse local file system and they can go through their file system and upload the file. And that comes with some built-in ability to reach out to like S3 and make that connection, make it really easy to send that file instead of having to like manually code those steps in the front end. And then there's a phone number field as well, which has like the country code and it has all of the input validation for phone numbers. So if a user puts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it'll fail because there isn't an area code 1, 2, 3. But if you put like 612 in, it'll pass. And so you can do a lot of front-end data validation to prevent bad data getting into your backend. And it also has access to the rest of AWS, so you're not limited to just a few AWS services if you use Amplify. If you need to, you can drop down to the Cloud Development Kit layer and basically build any custom thing as well. And then Appsync is something that you can use with Amplify pretty effectively. And essentially, it's serverless GraphQL APIs. GraphQL is a different kind of protocol than REST, but both of them accomplish moving data. And the nice thing is that Amplify can set up GraphQL for you, because GraphQL configuration is kind of a pain. So you also get things like CRUD APIs automatically. So you can do create, read, update, delete on items in your database with a generated API. So your developers aren't going in and trying to like manually create the functions for all of those things. And that's a big deal if you have an API that's huge with a lot of people working on it and it's changing frequently. That's a lot of work that it kind of takes out from that whole equation. And then also you can, with GraphQL, I think the reason they went with that as opposed to doing traditional REST is that GraphQL can do subscriptions, which is your real-time data. And that's where you're doing like Internet of Things, or you have like a dashboard that needs to update in real time efficiently according to changes in a database. It's kind of like WebSocket style instead of traditional API style. That's what you would use if you're doing like messaging in your app and you wanted to have that crisp, like fast speed for like chat conversations. And if you need to, you can grab a copy of your GraphQL schema and be able to generate the client locally, which is also helpful, because what that means is that you can build your Lambda functions, your serverless functions, and throw in a generated client, and that Lambda can now talk to your GraphQL API. And then finally, I just wanted to show an example of the templates directory. So this is AWS has 93 repositories that represent different Amplify templates. And in this case, let's see if I got it on the next. No, this is the last page. Okay. These are the kinds of things where you can do like the GPS pet tracking. There's a template in there for that as well. I got a React template. That's what I used when I was working with the startup recently. And it came with a whole bunch of stuff already pre-built by Amazon, which was super nice. And then it's also important because from a developer experience point of view, you want to know that there's example code out there for folks to go to see like what the best practices are, how they use the tool. You know, especially with infrastructure as code, if there's a whole bunch of examples out there, then you're not, then you have a lot of examples to work off of and learn from. And then one thing I forgot to mention about the APIs is you can also define authorization models. So should a logged in user who's the owner of a field of data in a table in DynamoDB, should they be able to create, read, update, delete that particular field? Super important for just about any app, because you don't want just anyone able to delete other people's stuff. So you can also define your authorization model in there as well.
In the front end.
Yep. And I think that's one of the really nice things about this is it brings all of your code into one repository. Because I've worked in a situation before in a startup where we had you know, our Flutter client repository, and then we had this front end repository, and then the Django backend repository. Oh, and here's our repository for all of our infrastructure as code. And it was just a pain trying to coordinate all of that together. Oops.
Conflict resolution seems like I don't have really a good way to say it, but it's like if you're handling authorization in the front end, and there's some other authorization handling for the back end, it seems like there's a possibility for conflict there. Does AWS have that? They must have some reconciliation or handshakes or shibboleths or something like that that are communicated between the two layers.
Yeah, so usually what I do is I work with like a Lambda directly to user, and the user's interacting there. And then the Lambda is the one that has the permission to do stuff like in the back end. So you're not directly authenticating users to your database. Like you don't want them to have direct access. So that's usually the way I've seen AWS handle it. Like when you create the GraphQL APIs, it will generate a whole bunch of Lambdas that handle each of those APIs. And those Lambdas will also talk to AWS Cognito to make sure that a user has authorization to actually, and authentication to do that. And because it works with that client on the front end, it's able to like pass the authenticated token that user created earlier and use that as part of it too. So there's that identity continuity, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah, it's that makes perfect. Like the identity holds the clearance, and then the clearance is reconciled across both layers, for want of a better term.
Yeah.
Because it shakes hands with the identity.
Yep, exactly. And you can do different kinds of identity management too as well. You don't have to use Cognito. It's just that's probably going to be your fastest, like rapid MVP style of doing it. But yeah, so that's the end of my presentation for now. I'm building this over time, so it'll probably grow as I get more experience. Anyone have any questions?
With the sandbox instances,
Mhm.
is it kind of like working in GitHub? So if you have multiple people, like you can push a commit and it will like when you're done your testing, if you're like ready to push it.
So the cool thing about the sandboxes is that each developer can get their own sandbox, or you can spin up a sandbox and then share the client details across the team. And that second use case is super useful for sandboxes where you want to populate them with a bunch of data, and then people can practice off of that. So
basically, sandbox is nothing but the virtual machine for each environment which you create on your own to experiment on, like any ecosystem. Like if you are working on Python, your sandbox is mostly filled with the environment related to that, whereas other sandbox can be filled with JavaScript-based ones.
Yeah, exactly. It was a huge improvement for me over manually working with AWS resources.
Yeah, actually, like because the dependencies are pretty complex and you need to have them in one place so that you don't get slipped away with the errors and integration systems.
Yeah, exactly.
Does this handle does it do a bunch of dependency management? I didn't ask just because it seems like it would off the shelf, but it's like, suppose you're pulling in other libraries. Is it smart enough to handle?
Oh yeah.
Because it's in AWS, so I'm assuming you're not going to do anything new with it. I mean,
it's not like that. AWS is a very scratch environment, and Amplify kind of simplified AWS basically. Like AWS is a pretty basic Linux environment, and you have to do everything with each and every step. From Cloud Shell and integrations is very complex in AWS, especially. GCP is simpler, and Azure is much more easier and like UI based ones. But AWS is not UI friendly or easily integrated.
100%.
So but Amplify kind of made it easy to make MVPs at least.
So you're saying Azure is the easiest?
Yeah.
And then
GCP second. Like this is for MVPs, it is pretty good actually. Like so production wise, I'm just
being able to spin up MVPs this is hot new commodity.
Yeah.
Right now.
Wikitube actually is deployed in this Amplify. Well,
oh really? I thought it was in Vercel. But it's
initially it was when you gave the demo to the IT department of excellence, that was in Amplify. Later we have moved from Amplify because of the costs to Vercel.
Nice. Yeah, and you can also access like all the AI resources too, like SageMaker if you want an endpoint to do inference or work with your AI model. If you're using Amplify, you can connect to that, and it's not so bad.
So can you spend more on the cost side, or is there something?
Not too costly, like not very, mostly $100 a month.
Yeah, and if anyone does go into AWS, I recommend looking into Cost Explorer. They actually have a breakdown, like very extensive breakdown, so you can see like per hour or per unit, like what you'll be actually charged, and then you can actually simulate what your costs would be as you scale up. So if you have someone who can kind of dig into the AWS Cost Explorer, you can do a lot of projections to be able to see, and that can help you also lower your cloud costs.
The cost of the band pricing, or is it different?
It depends. So there's some stuff is like by hour, some stuff is by unit, like read unit, write unit. So there's pretty complex equations for different services in AWS, but Cost Explorer like breaks down those actual equations so you can see. Like I saw there was one AI management service that was like $20 an hour, and if you don't notice that, it's like that can cost more than the rest of all of your stuff. So, and one thing that I think you have to be on the lookout for is called a denial of wallet attack, where someone figures out that they can hit your service a whole bunch of times, and because you're charged per use, then they can like rack up your bill massively.
They were kind of,
I have experienced some.
yeah, monthly there used to be times where 100 and 200K used to come as a bill actually
Can you fight that?
There are some ways to do it. So you can do things like rate limiting, where someone with a particular
alerts can be set actually like
yeah, and you can
reaches 10K,
alerts.
it sends out alerts to mails and stuff. Like these all things were not initially set up. Later they have like cloud has evolved and so it starts.
Yeah, I recently learned that FinOps now is a thing. Like
Yeah.
there's people who are dedicating their full-time job to monitoring costs of cloud services.
Yeah.
Because
You have
it
to.
gets exorbitant.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
Well,
our
and-
budget for 1 year is 12 million. Sorry, 12 million for 25 people. My team, like just the
Oh
cloud.
my
cost.
gosh.
Okay.
Crazy.
12.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, and you know, and I know, those FinOps people, they're also the people who are making bots to run up. You know, it's like,
I don't know anything about it other
it's
than
like,
it exists.
you know, this is a real tough neighborhood around here. You should really buy our services to manage your
The
costs.
bracket of cloud, cloud computing.
I was telling some students this week that, like, I was describing the different hats for hackers. And I was like, oh, and then there's these white hat hackers, which are not real. I was like, yeah, they're like unicorns. They're not real. It's like, yeah, they're the guys who work for antivirus companies during the day and make viruses at night.
Yeah.
Anybody else have questions about this?
I have like a newbie-ish question. So I'm a relatively recent developer. Like I learned to code back in the Stone Ages, but I've recently come back to it. Right? So I've had to teach myself Python and SQL and GitHub. But AWS and Azure, I kind of just know them very superficially.
Mhm.
So for someone like me, do you recommend starting here, or do you recommend knowing the basics and then moving here?
That's a very good question because I think both approaches have pros and cons. Like
Yeah.
if you dig into the basics, you'll have a better understanding. But also I think it's motivating to be able to get in and build quickly
Yeah,
and see stuff.
I know. That's why I came to
Yeah.
this. 'Cause I'm like, yeah, I want to learn how to do this quickly without having to learn all this
Yeah, no,
stuff.
this is definitely, I'd recommend getting into the cloud through this if
Okay.
you're doing AWS. And then it's nice because all it's doing is stuff that you would normally be able to do in AWS elsewhere. So you can go and actually visit like the page for DynamoDB and work with the whole normal user interface for DynamoDB, even though Amplify spun it up.
Yeah. Okay.
So